The superintendent of Loudoun County Schools has been fired in response to a grand jury report over the handling of 2 sexual assaults by the same student. Last year, the father of one of the assault victims accused the school board of covering up his daughter's sexual assault. The suspect transferred to another school where he reportedly assaulted yet another girl.
According to the just unsealed report, the school system failed at every juncture and missed multiple chances to prevent a second assault from happening. Both the Virginia Attorney General and Board of Supervisors chair called for Zeitler's immediate termination.
So we actually covered this on the show a lot before you were in the hosting chair. I believe Emily Jashinsky, former host, covered it as well, and her and I clashed on this one, actually, not on the show, but in like separate things we'd written. But what we do agree is there was a lot of, this was part of the kind of pushback against school boards not paying attention to constituents and parents' concerns, part of the vibe that helped elect Glenn Youngkin to be governor of Virginia. The issue specifically in this county, I mean, there were a number of issues of parents, fed up with pandemic policies and curriculum and other things, but there was also a concern about a sexual assault that had occurred in a school. And then it took on a very sort of political framing because the assailant had been described as perhaps gender fluid, and perhaps it was in a restroom that he or she wasn't supposed to be in, etc. Then and then there was another one that took place inside a classroom, so that one actually had nothing to do with it. The bathroom, from my mind, ended up seeming quite incidental. So we were trying to kind of brute force a anti-trans narrative that I don't think quite fit the situation. But what did fit the situation, it was true. There were assault accusations against this individual. It was not handled at all well by the superintendent. It was misrepresented to the board and then there were parents asking about it, and they were treated very dismissively. So this is a huge indictment of how this superintendent handled it, for the grand jury to look at this and say, yeah, this was a screw up. And now the school board taking action against him is, frankly, a vindication, I think, of a lot of frustration at this school board meetings in particular, in the year prior to this year.
So is this evidence then, if the superintendent has been fired, is this evidence of the system working, or do you think it's still evidence that there was I mean, is this a critique of school boards and being kind of dismissive of parents' interests? Is the issue that it just took too long and obviously should have happened early enough to stop the second assault from happening, obviously? But I mean, what's your attitude toward, if there was this broader cultural frustration with the inattentiveness to parents in the school board context, what does this outcome do to that tension?
Well, this is a good outcome, but one that probably was only arrived at because there was the parental outrage and the frustration and the people showing up very angrily to school board meetings. Someone was arrested, was detained at one of these school board meetings, who became very...
A teacher or a
No,
parent?
An angry parent was dragged away by law enforcement, who had said this was the parent of one of the victims, and they mistreated him horribly at someone who was there to express frustration about the safety of his kid. So I think this shows the validity of a lot of that anger, and a good result being arrived at only because there was a kind of grassroots movement to do something. And again, a strain that Youngkin really tapped into in his successful run for the governorship.
All of this stuff, I gotta say, about school boards and teaching and kids and everybody's different priorities. I mean, folks feel so fiercely about their children in ways that are sometimes admirable and sometimes blinkered. As a non-child having person. And it seems frankly overwhelming because you understand what everyone's interests are in looking after the thing that they love most in the world, and which seems so vulnerable, a child, and which is so vulnerable.
I mean, we're two non-child havers up here,
right? But at the same time, the nature of living in a community, the nature of living in society is a certain level of give and take, which, we're always talking about balancing interests and what are my interests in having a gun and being able to protect myself against somebody else's interest in being safe from gun violence. I mean, this is the entire political discussion we have as a community of 330 million people or whatever. and it's hard stuff. But it does feel to me oftentimes when we're having these conversations with respect to children, the inflexibility of our society that causes so many political problems is like that much more rigid because the stakes seem so high and people are so committed to the outcomes for their children.
Well,
and it's just really hard. That's all I'm saying. It's just very, very difficult.
I mean, I feel very strongly about parents and families having pretty ironclad rights for their own household, for their children's educational options. But there's parents on both sides
of this is the issue. There's somebody else's parents, a parent of a gender fluid student who feels like their child is being unfairly attacked. That's the problem.
Well, right. What I don't feel strongly about is trying to prescribe rules for how other parents parent. To the ever extent possible, I don't want to do that at all. Your kids are your kids. Different families can have different values, can have different things that fit different families, different educational environments that work, different policies that work.
But
it's really not on us
schools, and there's some standards that have to be put in place. I'm not in love
with the concept.
Well, even in a private school, standards have to be put in place, and people at the community still has to come to terms with what they want those standards to be. You can't escape this by silencing yourself more and more and more unless you just want to have a private tutor and your fiefdom with your armed guard standing outside of your house, as we were discussing yesterday. And you can reduce it down to that level, but the reality is that most people can't afford an armed guard, most people can't afford a private tutor, most people can't afford to build a moat around their home.
If we refunded them back the per pupil spending for school districts, they certainly could.
They can't.
It's a massive amount of money, the public school system.
People cannot create their own infrastructure, create their own power system, build their own houses. People don't have the resources to live on an island. That's why we live in a community. That's why
but what I'm saying
even society has evolved beyond the Stone Ages.
Education can be publicly paid for, sure. Does it need to be publicly provided, is I think the question.
I'm not having a conversation about that. The point that I'm making is that when you choose to live in a society, which we all do, because no one's Thoreau out in the forest right now, that there is necessarily going to be trade-offs. And all I'm doing is trying to acknowledge, I'm not taking a side here, I'm just really trying to acknowledge how difficult it is. And that if people, I think, especially with respect to children, because the stakes feel so high and people are so passionate about their kids, if there was more of an acknowledgement, I think, that those interests exist on both sides of all of these equations, I think that having a little bit more grace in these situations would endure to everybody's benefit, because it's just so difficult. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and conservatives who have an impulse right now or an interest in really trying to bring the state into, because they're concerned about, frankly, concerned about sexual abuse and trans issues and all that, it will not benefit conservative parents to have the state more involved in parenting decisions in the community. So many, we talk a lot about, actually I'm going to post it later today on Reason's website, a great post by my colleague Lenore, who covers these issues of Child Protective Services. And another example, she has 10 of these a day of family, let their 9-year-old play outside in the front yard for too long, and some nosy neighbor sicks the state on them, and the policies that have been arrived at by the community or its representatives are nonsensical and are ridiculous and are infringing on this family's right. They trust their 9-year-old is a responsible person. It's fine.
Absolutely.
It just happens all the time.
For sure.
And very bad stuff.
Yeah.
According to a source familiar with the firing, Ziegler will be paid his annual salary and compensation for the next year. Oh, that's nice. That includes a $12,000 annual vehicle allowance, health insurance, and retirement benefits.
Well, look, mismanaging something I don't think means that you shouldn't be able to pay for cancer. Mm-hmm. We live in a hellscape where your health insurance is your ability to survive a treatable disease is tied to your ability to stay employed. And I don't think that we should lose our humanity and be wishing that people be in the wild, wild west of dying from treatable illnesses simply because they've made a bad decision in an employment context. So if you don't want various institutions to have to keep supporting folks in this way, we have to support a social safety net that allows folks to ethically cut ties with people who have done wrong.
All right. I would rather have a social safety net than be obligated to pay the car benefits for public. Look
at this!
Public sector workers who screw up.
Comes out in favor of the social safety net, Medicare for all. You heard it here first, folks. All right. Let's end on that positive note. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.